the Faster Than Light radio show.
Welcome once again to the show, and thanks for joining you. Thanks for joining us. I'm glad I've joined you, and I hope you're glad you've joined me. That's the way to start a show. Why not get confused at the very beginning? Don't leave it till the end, I say. Look, seriously, this week we're dealing with the second program looking at children's science fiction, and that's going to follow in about 5 or 6 minutes if my voice manages to hang on that long. First of all, I thought we might have another reading from the Illustrated Book of Science Fiction Lists. This is a book that I was using about a month back now, quite regularly, but I gave it up because it seemed that there were so many other important things happening around about in the science fiction world. But I figured we must start off this program with something pertinent, something interesting, and so I decided we might have a look at one of the more interesting lists. Well, how about 20 science fiction writers who have had stars or craters named after them? Well, that sounds like certainly a weird sort of thing to have happened. Well, do you know that there have been lunar craters named after Hugo Gernsback, the man for whom the Great Science Fiction Award, voted on annually by the fans and coming up soon again for 1983 in August, the Hugo Award, named after Hugo Gernsback. He's got a lunar crater named after him. Willy Ley, one of the early writers, and of course H.G. Wells, all have craters named after them. If you travel on to Mars, you'll find there's a crater on Mars named after John W. Campbell. There's another named after Stanley Weinbaum, very interesting author who produced probably the first science fiction story that favourably looked at aliens, called A Martian Odyssey. So it's very appropriate that he should have a Martian crater named after him. I wonder if it is an odyssey or a little oddity. There's also H.G. Wells up there with a crater. Seems like he gets around everywhere else. I find that fascinating, really. How about 9 science fiction writers who are also medical doctors? Did you know that T.J. Bass, the author of The God Whale, still available in a Magnum edition around the newsagents and the bookshops in Perth, he's also a medical doctor. How about Miles Brewer, who was very popular in the early Hugo Gernsback magazines? Did you know that Arthur Conan Doyle was a doctor, studied medicine at Edinburgh University? Or did you know, too, that F. Paul Wilson, who produces some rather strange fiction currently being published, he is a GP in New Jersey? Well, all of that information came from the Illustrated Book of Science Fiction Lists by Mike Ashley, published by Virgin Press at the end of last year. It's a very interesting read, and it contains some wonderful trivia. Just the way to start a program. I get many magazines here at Murdoch University, or the library does. I'm just privileged enough to be able to see them. Any reader, by the way, can come out here and have a look at them on the open shelves, in the book stack. Some really good material. One of the most recent magazines, one of the very good critical review magazines in science fiction, is called Foundation, and we've received the 27th issue. To give you some idea of the sort of stuff you can get into when you look at the magazines of science fiction, I find that not only the articles, sometimes very, very interesting. There's interesting articles in this particular magazine, one of them dealing with Neil Ferguson, a new writer, looking at the influence on him of Philip K. Dick, unfortunately, who died at the beginning of last year. There's R.G. Medley on Aldous and a dose of Tono Bungay. That sounds an interesting sort of article, doesn't it? There's also Rudy Bucker looking at the land of the moral majority and what that means to science fiction currently. In fact, issue 27 is quite a tribute to Phil Dick, with a number of authors, a number of writers, putting in letters and saying what they thought of the article that was published in issue 26. So in a sense, this carries on the tribute to Philip K. Dick that was in the previous issue. Harlan Ellison, Ursula Le Guin and Robert Lowndes all have articles in there talking about Phil Dick. Very interesting issue. I find that the letters column is one of the most interesting things about the professional critical magazines of science fiction, where the authors themselves argue about the worth and relative worth of various works in the science fiction field. And sometimes that makes very interesting reading if you've got your own ideas and have read the books in question. Foundation, one of the critical magazines in science fiction. There's a full run of it available at Murdoch University, and I'd commend it to you. Well, without too much further ado, let us take a little look into a world of science fiction that I'm afraid many of the readers are unaware of. Welcome once again to the nursery world of science fiction, children's science fiction. A little bit of the nursery hymn there from the Pentateuch, an amazing science fictional record which I aim to use on our future programs. We're looking at the Lion imprint this week. Lion is the children's imprint of William Collins. It's an off-branch of their paperback world known as Fontana. Lion books have turned out to be quite a little rampant force in the last 8 or 9 years or so, as they went about acquiring those authors that they have published in hardcover, that is, William Collins have published in hardcover, acquiring them for their own paperback list. This meant that they had to buy back a number of authors who had already been published in existing paperback lists for children, and as I was talking about last week, in the main this meant buying them back from Puffin. Two authors in question that they've done this with are C.S. Lewis and Alan Garner. I'm leaving Alan for comments a little further on in the show. Let's first of all look at C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis is an author most of you will be familiar with. Clive Staples Lewis was a good friend of J.R.R. Tolkien's up at Cambridge, Oxford, wherever they were, Oxford, and he was one of those sort of chaps that too was very interested in creating fantasy. Unlike Tolkien, who did it for no particular purpose, or I believe that to be the case on reading the books, he certainly didn't have an axe to grind or a series of thoughts or packages or ideas to present that would actually convince you of something in our current reality. He just wanted to create a livable and a lovable alternate reality in which one could bathe one's thoughts, and thus Middle-earth. Lewis, on the other hand, created Narnia, the kingdom for which he's best named, as a metaphor, as an allegory, if you like, for religious life, Christian religious life. He was a deeply convicted Christian himself. This shines through in the work, and knowing the allegorical basis for the works gives one an understanding of them. That's not to lessen their impact, as they are quite a good read. I say that advisedly. A number of critics of recent times have come back to look at the Narnia series of books and have found them to be lacking as literature. That is, they, like many things that are more interested in the ideas and the conviction behind the story, make the story itself a little bit weak and hard to take. If you look at the actual language that's being spoken between the kids in the Narnia series, then it falls flat. But that doesn't lessen the impact for the children who read the stories. They've loved them for the last 40 years or so, and I don't see any reason for that to change. Actually, they've loved them for the last 30 years or so, as most of them came out in the 1950s, didn't they? C.S. Lewis's most popular fiction is for children, and it is allegorical fantasy, as I've already said, rather than science fiction, although the stories themselves use many science fictional devices, including time travel, other dimensions, and parallel worlds. The Kingdom of Narnia, which is the one Lewis is best remembered for, to which various human children travelled, is ruled by a lion, Aslan, who is crucified, and that's the sense in which it happens, rather than physically is crucified on a cross, by a wicked witch. Many excitingly described perils take place in this land, most with a direct Christian allegorical implication or application. They are much loved by many children who may or may not, often not presumably, pay much attention to their religious import. The series consists of The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, Prince Caspian, The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, The Silver Chair, The Horse and His Boy, The Magician's Nephew, which comes first in terms of the internal chronology, and The Last Battle. That is the order in which they are in fact published. He has written a number of minor fantasies for adults, one, The Great Divorce in 1945, about heaven and hell and a bus that travels between the two, and I certainly found it a very interesting read when I encountered it 10 years ago, and another, Till We Have Faces, which came out in 1956, a retelling of the myth of Cupid and Psyche. C.S. Lewis's contribution to S.F. Proper came with a trilogy which dealt with the Perelandra trilogy, as they're called, Out of the Silent Planet, A Voyage to Venus, and The Tortured Planet. These are not children's books, so let's hark back to Narnia. Narnia, when it was repurchased, if you like, by Collins for the Lion imprint, I felt, well, there's a very, very courageous publisher indeed, taking one of the most popular series out of the Puffin imprint, surely one which has sold well and saturated the market for generations, taking that on themselves and attempting to relaunch it. But certainly marketing's got a lot to do with the way in which books sell these days, new covers on the Narnia series, a new package, a new box, and a little upping of the price. And hey presto, Narnia was off and running once again, until in the current generation of readers it's as popular as it ever was, and probably a little more read with the flashy covers, and they certainly are very, very beautiful indeed. Lion's taken a lot of time and care to package their acquisitions for their children's list in fantasy and science fiction particularly well. That's the Narnia series. You can buy them at any good bookseller around town. It is constantly available, and if you can handle the allegorical nature of the stories, and like Peter Nichols was saying in the little comments that I was reading, most kids don't tend to hit upon the Christian implications as quickly as adults do, and so the kids read them for the riveting stories that they are and the way in which they just roll along. Well, all those hesitations aside on my part, I still think they're a pretty good read. There is one other author that I feel I ought to mention who is in the fantasy vein and connected with Lion imprints, and that's a character called Lloyd Alexander. Lloyd Alexander is an American author who has taken on Welsh mythology as the basis for doing a number of children's books, 5 in all, which make up a series known as, well, I suppose the series is called the Book of Three series or something after that nature. They're the chronicles of a particular kingdom called Prydain, and in fact the series is best known presumably as the Chronicles of Prydain, Prydain. This particular group of books, 5 in all, deals with the Book of Three, which starts off the stories, the Black Cauldron, the Castle of Lyre, the Taran Wanderer, and finally the High King. It's a series of quest novels. It's a series of young protagonists, a boy and a girl, coming to understand their own powers, their own abilities within a kingdom, and warring against evil. The basis in Welsh mythology is very strong indeed. In the first book, the Book of Three, there is an oracular pig, and I, for one, as coming a reader coming out of basically Tolkien and other sorts of fantasies, found this very hard to take. A pig that was talking back and giving forth with the future. But this is a firm basis in Welsh mythology and is certainly well used by Lloyd Alexander. It just takes some getting used to. Lloyd Alexander is a good writer and one who used the material of Welsh mythology to spin out a clever group of meaningful tales for a current generation. That's what myth-making and reusing a fable really is all about. Take the old age raw material and spin it out with a new meaning for a new generation. Lloyd Alexander's accomplished that. He's an award-winning author. The High King was a book which got a lot of praise and a number of awards when it was first published in the United States. They are all available now as Lion paperbacks, and you can buy them for around about $2 at most good booksellers. The final book in the series, The High King, is probably the best read, although I found for myself where the stories were set up in the Book of Three, it was just as exciting. That is pure fantasy, magic, very few science fictional elements if you take the other world as being the only element really that's being used. That's the Chronicles of Prydain by Lloyd Alexander, also in the Lion paperback imprint. There are a number of minor authors which I will leave to the end of the show who have 1 or 2 titles of particular note in the Lion imprint, but there is one major author whom one cannot escape when one goes into a bookshop and looks at the Lion paperbacks, and that's Alan Garner. By any stretch of the imagination, Alan is an important author who's contributed greatly to the development of science fiction and the level of complexity that science fiction for children entails for the current generation. His book Redshift broke a lot of ground and I believe was an adult novel really that got submerged in the children's science fiction paperback lists. If you're unfamiliar with Alan Garner's Redshift, then get a hold of a copy and read a multi-layered novel that works on a number of different levels. It's set in 2 or 3 time streams and all of them are linked together by an axe, which is the one focal point that allows the different protagonists to be drawn across time and the story to drift between them. It's an exciting novel and one that I'm sure you'll be very, very pleased to get a hold of if you're unaware of it. Earlier material of Alan's dealt itself with the Welsh mythology. Alan Garner was in Australia in March attending a conference in Canberra on reading. He did not come to Western Australia, although he was in Sydney and Melbourne for a brief period. I rang up the publisher's offices in Sydney and managed to capture an interview with him. My technician would say capture should be used advisedly, as Alan appears to be down the end of a long tunnel being run over by a train. Well, I'll leave that up to you. What he's saying is important. I'll give you 5 minutes of Alan Garner talking. Listen to what he's saying in the background of the hubble and bubble of the modern technology. Alan Garner.
I felt an affinity, which has only intensified with subsequent reading and knowledge. And I think it was partly to do with a peculiar childhood that I had, in that I was isolated and I kept having very serious illnesses. I was thrown in on myself, and I had nothing to refer to except my own inner resources. My concepts of time were quite different from straightforward concepts. I could treat time subjectively as though it was a plastic ball. I could shift it around. So I discovered both the eternal present, things always happening in the eternal present, and also a sense of timelessness, which immediately made sense when I discovered the Aboriginal concepts of dream time.
Sure.
I felt I knew all about dream time. I'd been there.
Yeah.
The future and the present and the past all amalgamating it in one great time.
Right.
That was one thing. And also, I come from a family that is very deeply rooted in a particular area in Cheshire. They have always lived on the same hill, and they have worked it as craftsmen. And so they have mined it, and they've chopped trees down, and they've built houses, and they've altered the landscape. And I had this shared family knowledge, all the awareness of one's rootedness in place. But because of my illnesses and because of later education, I was forced away from contact with the people of my own family. And in that sense of, in that moment of alienation, I tended to latch quite heavily onto the one place that did not, in my words at the time, let me down. And that was Alderley Edge, the hill where my family had always lived and worked. And so I became very deeply immersed in a relationship with a particular place, the rocks and the trees, which of course is very close to the Aboriginal concept of the land.
Sure.
So both time and land had interreacted with me as a child. And when I came to discover Aboriginal cultures, I felt distinctly that I'd been there before.
Sure.
But I wouldn't be so arrogant as to pretend that I knew in the particular or anything about the Aboriginal problems or the crises of culture that they've met. I would not wish ever to be thought that I was commenting on that. I'm talking entirely about the basic mythological context of Aboriginal beliefs.
You're so much a person of, as you said already, of the place in Cheshire that you were born and brought up, even though you went away to study from there. That sense of dislocation that you must have had when you were, I take it, at Oxford, was it, studying, can you understand or sense something of what an Australian person must have of coming from England and being, in some sense, cut off completely from the landscape of their mythology?
I can indeed. I mean, I understood it intellectually before I got here. But in meeting people, I found that almost relentlessly the conversation has worked round that acute form of dislocation, distress, and in many cases actual pain is felt, both by the straightforward emigrant who's come out from Europe somewhere and settled in Australia, and also the sense of not having roots in Australia.
That was Alan Garner. Seemed to be speaking from a long way away, didn't he? Sydney doesn't seem that far. Has someone said when they were listening to it, maybe it was in a laundromat. Well, it's got that feel about it. I trust you enjoyed what Alan was saying. The question I directed to him at the beginning was about the way in which he'd used Aboriginal culture in a lecture, the way in which he felt mythology related, the Aboriginal mythology related, and how much he understood it. And from that he worked around, in that interview, the whole sense of talking about myth being where one is grounded, and the reason why I think we, Australian readers, tend to not use Aboriginal myth and understand it in our children's literature, and for that matter in our adult literature, is because our roots are elsewhere. The myths that we carry are essentially European, and thus Alan Garner is a writer of relevance to us, because what he is talking about and what he is using is European mythology, essentially British mythology, and mythological ideas and images, and they're the ones which seem to echo deep in our own lives and make some sense. Alan Garner's earlier books, The Weird Stone of Brizinghamen and The Moon of Gomroth, are virtually pure retelling of mythology, with current characters being sucked back into adventures that are happening. They are available as Lion paperbacks. You shift out of that pure usage of early Welsh mythology, essentially, and the mythology that surrounds his little area that he was talking about in England, and from that material you come into works such as Ellador and the Owl Service, where the mythology is there, sure, but now it's being retold in a very, very powerful and a very current way. The Owl Service was made into a good BBC children's TV series, if you can remember back that far. Ellador itself is a beautiful novel about a world in which the colour is being drained away, a world which is going drab and flat, and the children protagonists, who come through an old bomb site in England, in London, are sucked into this world, and they're the ones who bring about the lightness and the re-establishment of the true nature. It's quite an exciting book as well. From that, of course, there was Red Shift, and it would seem that Alan Garner, on that progression of 5 novels, got more and more complex and more deeper in what he was telling. These days, in the current decade, most of the last Red Shift came out in the very early 1970s. For the last decade, he has concentrated on going back to the barest essentials, and he's told a series of essentially fairy stories in the Fairy Tales of Gold, which read as though they'd been collected by Brothers Grimm, and probably that's the best homage that one could pay to them. They are totally made up by Alan Garner, and yet they have the authenticity of centuries of retelling. He said later on in the interview, I must admit I couldn't inflict it all on you, later on in the interview that was some of the hardest writing he's ever done in his life, and it's only after 20 years or so of writing that he felt he was able to tackle the telling of fairy tales as such a simple idea, but such complex in the way in which it needs to, the rigours it needs to apply to language. Well, that is Alan Garner, and boy, he's an exciting writer. Whatever he publishes as an author is worth having a look at. Sometimes it's hard to understand, sometimes it's quite difficult, but it's always rewarding. Alan Garner is published these days under the Lion imprint, and it's Lions we're talking about. To take out the show, 2 authors that are Lion, have been taken up in the Lion series that you may be unaware of. One of them is Robert O'Brien. I mentioned Robert O'Brien last week when I was talking about puffins because of the Rats of Mrs. Frisby and the Rats of Nim, which has been turned into The Secret of Nim, the cartoon feature that was on over the May holidays around town. He's got another science fiction book, and it really is science fiction. So is Mrs. Frisby, by the way. It's worth looking into. This is called Z for Zachariah. Z for Zachariah is the tale of a girl who believes that she is the last person alive after a nuclear holocaust in the United States. For a series of strange reasons, the valley in which she isn't as heavily contaminated with fallout as the rest of the area. Her family go away to try and find help, and in the process apparently of being killed, she is left on her own. Into her valley wanders a man in a suit, dragging a cart. The man is essentially in an anti-radiation suit of his own making. This man is tortured for his own reasons, the reasons why he is wearing the suit, and she, the girl, has to hide from him, make contact with him, and have an interaction which makes a very, very powerful story. Z for Zachariah. If you're unfamiliar with it, it's on a number of school reading lists. It's still available as a Lion paperback, $2.95 these days. It's worth getting hold of and having a read. It's a very, very powerful tale indeed, one that features a girl, which a lot of science fiction novels don't, and a girl who is very, very well drawn, and her tale is very, very well told. A wonderful little tale of Anne Burden and her valley, Z for Zachariah. The other author I want to mention before we close the show is Louise Lawrence. She is another American author who's contributed a number of works of science fiction and is unknown, really, to most of the readers in our current generation. She is unknown because she publishes children's science fiction, and all of her works go into children's science fiction lists, and as such, they're not ones that adults pick up very readily at all. Louise Lawrence has written a series of stories. Probably the strongest is The Power of Stars. It's available as a Lion paperback. My copy's got $1.50 on the back, but I fear I bought it a number of years ago, but it is still in print. It is a story of two characters, Jimmy and Alan, one suspicious and the other blinded by love for a particular girl. It would appear that the stars, the power of the stars, became manifest one night and accidentally possessed Jane, and the power is seeking to establish itself on Earth. These two characters, Jimmy and Alan, fighting for Jane, are also fighting for saving the Earth from the power of the stars. It's suspense, got a surprise ending, a convincing atmosphere, and characterisation which make this a particularly impressive combination of features for a science fiction novel for the young adult. And talking of science fiction novels for the young adult, the week after next, I'll be returning to look at more children's science fiction, looking at a list designed specifically for the young adult readers rather than maybe the more juvenile audience. Next week, I'll give you a report on the Australian Science Fiction Convention that took place over the weekend of June 10th, 11th in Sydney. And stay tuned for that, because it promises to be quite an exciting event with a number of author interviews and some chats with some of the fans and possibly some of the hype that goes together with a science fiction convention. All of that next week. Bye for now.
Take us away, take us away.